Welcome back, listeners. Thank you for joining me again today. One of the big challenges for a lot of managers, a lot of leaders, and a lot of business owners in today's complex world of fast-paced business and the Great Resignation and quiet quitting and all of these kind of employment challenges is the responsibilities that are incumbent upon an employer under the law. So to help me understand that a bit better from the American perspective, at least, is employment law specialist and attorney Alan Crone for joining us from the USA. So we're going to be talking about how employment law works, what some of the misunderstood concepts are, what some of the most common issues are that he's had to deal with in his 30-year career in the law, as well as some of the lessons he's learned about leadership from that time. This is Leading with Integrity Leadership Talk, the podcast for first-time managers who are working in tech-driven businesses and teams and who want to be more effective, people-first leaders. Each week, you will learn the crucial strategies, mindsets, and practical tips that successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers who get the best from their teams. And we'll achieve all of this via weekly conversations with leaders, with leadership experts, entrepreneurs, and business owners, people who have already walked this path and have some amazing insights to share, with an added sprinkling of occasional solo episodes and some group chats where we'll have multiple guests. My name is David Hatch, and I will be your host. And leadership has always been a passion for me. After a career spent in a series of small businesses during 15 years in the aerospace industry, 5 or 6 of those at the end of that career were in a space startup in the UK. So trying to launch satellites into orbit, very cool stuff. And through all of that experience, I learned that the secret to successful management is in the ability to apply great leadership. And in turn, the secret to great leadership, it's all about your integrity, putting people before profits.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Well, Alan, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us today. And we're going to talk about all things employment law and a bit about leadership as well. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, very welcome. Yeah. And to start us off, usually the best place to start, I find, is I hand over the virtual mic to you to introduce yourself to the listeners, tell them a bit about yourself, your business, what you do, and what gets you out of bed in the morning, really.
All right. Well, my name is Alan Crone. I'm the founder and CEO of the Crone Law Firm, which we're an employment law firm located in Memphis, Tennessee, and St. Louis, Missouri. And we represent employers, executives, and entrepreneurs in legal matters that affect their ability to make a living. And I've been in employment law for 30 plus years. I've also am a recovering politician. I've been involved in my community and really enjoy doing that volunteer work. What gets me out of bed in the morning, my job, I've kind of transferred or shifted into more of the management here at the firm. Still run a few cases, but mainly I see my job as making everybody else look better. My job is to make other people money, to help other people succeed in my firm, and just help us achieve our firm mission, which is to help people get a level playing field and transform the American workplace into an efficient, fair system. So that's what we do. And it took me a long time, but I love what I do. I love this mix of what I do. And it was great to get up early this morning and come talk to you.
Well, I'm pleased to hear it. And I have to say, that's actually a really nice way of describing leadership, isn't it? Is my job is to make everyone else look good.
I find if you do that, success follows for everybody. And what better goal than for everybody to be successful? I know there are a lot of people out there who think, well, if so and so succeeds, then that takes away from me. One thing I learned in politics is that's what the great thing about credit is. Credit is unlimited. You can give credit to everybody, and there's still plenty of credit for yourself. So, I find that every time I do that, I'm happy. But when I'm focused more on myself, I'm not as happy. So that's kind of how I got to this place.
Yeah, I like it. And you can say the same thing about gratitude as well, can't you? It's self-creating, self-perpetuating. So there we go. I'm really interested to get into some of the aspects of employment law, particularly I know in the US it works very differently to how it does here in the UK, for example. So it'll be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on that. And to start us off on that topic, what are the three most common workplace issues that you tend to deal with in your firm from an employment law perspective?
Well, I think the biggest is a lack of communication and a lack of confrontation. A lot of people come to see me when they are maybe they've been fired or they're on the process towards being fired, and they really are confused and they don't understand why these things are happening to them, and so they kind of if they happen to be black or a female or maybe LGBTQ or some other protected class, they say, well, I can't figure out what it is, so it must be this other thing. And I think in America, we're really bad at confronting people in a positive way, setting up expectations and letting people know when they don't meet those expectations. And so that's the first thing is communication. I think communication is key. And if people communicated better, they probably would put me out of business, to be honest with you, or at least I'd have to change my business. So that's the first thing is communication. The second is similar to it, and that's expectations. A lot of employers don't know really what they expect of their own employees. And therefore, if you don't know what you expect, how can you expect your employee to understand that? So I think defining roles and again, communicating those roles to people is very important. And I find that doesn't happen a long time. And then the third thing is there are just some bad people out there. There's some people that have biases and prejudices that are deep seated, and they act on those. We have people that don't understand how to exhibit their own sexuality correctly, and so they make comments or they take advantage of people in subordinate positions. And you've got to, as an employer, you've got to be on the lookout for those folks, and you can't make accommodation for those folks. You've got to nip that kind of activity in the bud. And unfortunately, that's part of human nature. It's part of human behavior. And when companies don't take that seriously, then they create a lot of liability for themselves, and they hurt a lot of people.
Sadly so, yes. So the communication and the expectations, it's wrapped up in that. There's that fear of confrontation, isn't there? And a lot of managers and business leaders, they tend to try to avoid those difficult conversations. Whereas in the long run, if they just have it early on and everyone's on the same page from the beginning, exactly as you've said, then in the long run, it's actually a lot easier than just putting it off and putting it off and putting it off until it becomes this unavoidable monster of a problem.
That's right. I was talking to someone yesterday, and we were talking about terminations, and we were having this conversation. And I said, and then they end up firing somebody. And he said, and it's probably 6 to 9 months later than they should have done it. And that's so true. I mean, unless you're just a psychopath, no one likes to fire people, right? I mean, no one gets up in the morning and says, oh, goody, I get to go fire Betty today. Most people don't want to do it. Most workers want to be successful. You know, they want to succeed. And either you've made a decision somewhere along the line as a manager that has led you to that point. You've got to own when someone fails in your organization, you've got to own that, because either you hired the person for the wrong job. You know, either they didn't have the skill set or the aptitude or whatever it might be to do that particular job, or you haven't trained them correctly to do the job to meet your expectations. And if you've communicated all of that, if you were careful in hiring someone, you know, there are people out there, I get it, that just don't perform, you know, for whatever reason. They get a job, and there's a small percentage of them. Just like we said, there's some people that are just bad people. There's some bad employees, and those you've got to head on. And as in the movie Bull Durham, the manager said, the organization's got to make a change. And, you know, professionals understand that. The sooner you can make that change, you free that person up to go be their best self somewhere else, and you can get somebody in that really can do the job. But most of the time, if you confront people and say, here's how we want this done, here's some successes, here's some steps for success, most people will conform to it if they're able to. And if they're not able to, then you've made a mistake in putting them in that impossible position.
Yeah, or as you said, you've not defined what you're expecting from them in the first place. You've not agreed how that's going to be measured, and you're not both on the same page from the start. Very much agree with you. Like, the sooner you get rid of that person, if it is that bad employee type person, for their own benefit as much as anything else, but also for the benefit of your wider team. Because if there is that underperforming, that bad, that toxic kind of person that's there, and you're putting off that conversation, the biggest damage a lot of times is to everyone else who has to work with them. And that's why I think it's such an important part of leadership, actually. Not that I advocate firing people quickly or anything, but
no, I mean, I think it's better to fire quickly than slowly. You know, I think in America and probably all over the world, we focus on firing as opposed to hiring. And if you do your work in hiring, then you don't have to fire anybody. And I think it starts with a company's mission. You know, I'll bet you if I stopped people on the street and said, where do you work? And they told me, and I said, quick, tell me, what is your company's mission? A lot of people would probably hem and haw around that and give you something that's kind of close. But if people can't say, our mission is to represent employees, executives, and entrepreneurs in legal matters that affect their ability to make a living, and they can't come back with that quickly, well, then I failed because I haven't communicated my mission. So the first thing is you got to recruit to your mission. And then you've got to understand how each role fits into that mission, how it fits into your in my case, a law firm. And you've got to hire to that. We have 5 value pillars: excellence, service, reliability, transparency, and integrity. And we talk about that in the hiring process. And I have a whole section when I'm talking to potential job candidates. I talk about the reasons not to come to work here. You know, if you don't like accountability, if you don't like public accountability, and some people don't come to work here. If you don't like following systems, don't come to work here. You've got to know what it is that makes your organization unique, but also what makes it run. And there's some people, not everything is for everybody. And the fact that somebody's been an accountant for 15 years doesn't mean that they've got the knowledge and training and experience that you need for an accountant. So you've either got to hire to that experience or you've got to train them up to get to your point. I think a lot of people just hire some people and say, all right, well, it's an accountant. I've got an accounting role. Well, there you go. Go ahead. You're supposed to know everything. And when they don't meet expectations that haven't been communicated to them, now all of a sudden there's an issue. So I think you've really got to hire slow and fire fast. If you've made a mistake in that hiring process and somehow you've misread the person or misread their qualifications, then again, do everybody a favor and go ahead and pull the trigger on that sooner rather than later. But do your homework on the front end so you don't have to do that. There's nothing more expensive for a company than having to rehire, have high turnover anywhere in its organization.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the number that keeps getting thrown around lately is 300% of their annual salary to replace someone who leaves or you have to get rid of. So,
right.
Yeah, it's not cheap.
It's not.
Another similar question. What do you think is the most misunderstood issue that you found in representing? I know you've done thousands of cases for both sides, employees and employers.
That's a great question. I think that probably the most misunderstood from a legal standpoint is, at least in this country, just how few rights workers have. We have the employment at will doctrine here, which we got from Great Britain, being a former colonial possession. I always tell people, think lords and serfs. That's really where the American worker starts. We had slavery, which is a lot worse than lords and serfs. So we've, as a society, as Western civilization, capitalism has always treated workers as less than. And I think that people don't understand that you can be treated unfairly, you can be treated arbitrarily, but if you don't fall into certain protective categories or certain protected activity, then you really don't have any rights. And the other thing kind of is on the other side of that. It's a mirror image of that. I think a lot of times, particularly today, workers don't understand how much relative negotiating position they have, and they have it before they get hired. And so they need to negotiate any terms, before the honeymoon starts, before the boss says you're hired. And there's oftentimes there's a lot of negotiating that can go on because they want you, and you've got something valuable to trade. And so, being attuned to that can help solve some problems down the road. And I realize that, like I say, that's two sides of the same coin. They sound contradictory, but they also kind of go hand in hand, because employment at will assumes kind of an open marketplace. And really, until recently, at least in this country, you didn't really have that two-way streak. Now, after the, whatever they're calling it, the Great Resignation and quiet quitting and all of those things, now all of a sudden a good worker who's reliable and capable and honest and all of those great attributes is valuable, and you can negotiate from that position of value.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we were talking just now about be slow in your hiring, but I think from what you're saying there, certainly in the US, the same applies for when you're the job seeker. Be slow in that. Make sure you do that negotiation before the honeymoon period, as you call it, and make sure that you're picking the right employer as much as you ever can. And assuming you have the luxury of that choice as well, of course, because not everyone will, sadly. Yeah,
and that's true to different extents at different times. Economy turns and there are no jobs, and all of a sudden, I've got to put food on the table, so I got to do these things. Although I think, in 2023, there's so many other options. Everything from being an influencer to doing freelance work online. My daughter just graduated from college, and she's looking for a job in comedy writing. I know there's a writer strike as we're taping this, but if anyone out there needs a good comedy writer, give me a call. I'll hook you up. But she's doing all sorts of things, from walking dogs to doing some on-screen project work and other things. She may actually be making more money than she would in a right out of the school job. So it's different than when I was coming out of school, and your only option was, well, you get a job in your career and you progress from there. And because of that, I think that gives workers a little more leverage than they would have had 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we talk about this kind of generational shift over the last couple of generations, and so even my parents, like, they would have spent decades in the same role. My dad did. He worked for the same company for over 40 years. But even into my generation, the next one down, most people won't stay in a job more than 5 or 10 years in my generation, and the next generation is more like 1 to 2 years now. But what we never actually think about, or certainly I haven't until you just said that, is the reason behind that. It's not so much a change in mindset, is it? It's just there's so many more options available now than there were. And you're right. I mean, all you need is an internet connection these days, and you can go and make some money doing something. So, yeah, very good point.
You make money playing video games.
Well, yes. Funnily enough, I did have an interview with another guest a few weeks ago who works in esports, which actually it's not as easy as it sounds, annoyingly.
Well, I know a young man that he would play Call of Duty on Twitch, and people would tip him. And it was as much a performance as anything else. He's talking, and it's not so much but they're watching him play a game and they're interacting with him. And he made very good money doing that. And again, I think the point isn't necessarily quit your day job and get on Twitch and play video games, but it's as you said, the opportunities are just so different. Most of the jobs that were the big money jobs when I was coming out of school, a lot of them don't exist anymore. Stockbroker. There's no such thing as a stockbroker anymore. They're financial advisors now, and they're paid completely differently. Because of online, they lost their monopoly, and that's just a kind of a run-of-the-mill job. Being a doctor, a physician isn't as lucrative as it used to be. Being a lawyer certainly isn't what it used to be. So I think employers and everybody else really have to look at where we are in 2023 and realize that this must have been how people felt during the Industrial Revolution, and everything was becoming automated, and things were moving from agriculture to industry and into the cities and everything else. So we're in a period of transition, and it's the changes are happening at lightning speed. It's just crazy, go nuts.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there about one of the biggest differences actually is the pace of change. Industrial Revolution happened over quite a long period of time. Whereas, the last decade or so, those changes have just been getting more and more frequent, haven't they? Like the speed at which technology changes and evolves and gets more complicated, probably certainly from my perspective.
Every generation says that the next generation is completely different than they are. But in my case, it's true, right? You look at my dad and I, we basically had the same, take high school. We basically had the same high school experience, 3 or 4 television channels, landlines, air conditioning, automobiles, level of technology may have been a little bit different, but, he or I wanted to ask a girl out. The process was pretty much the same. You either saw them in the hall or you called them or whatever. My kids, completely different, social structure, the way they approach dating, the way they approach finding a job, the way they approach deciding what they're going to do for dinner, completely different. If just night and day difference. And when you take that as a microcosm of the larger society, it really is amazing that the world isn't more chaotic than it is, because it's just so much different. But man, what a great time to be alive, to see all of these changes, and to, you got to take the bad with the good, but the good is great. It's just a great time to be a human being. And so hopefully we'll continue to adapt and change. And, 50 years from now, we'll come out on the other side of this, a better society, hopefully, with more opportunity for people.
You're absolutely right. It's definitely an interesting time to be alive. Yeah, I guess it's a double-edged sword, isn't it, the internet? Because on the one hand, you've got access to every piece of human knowledge that does or has ever existed, probably, literally at your fingertips. And then on the other side, you've just got this horrible, toxic, poisonous part of the internet that just destroys everything. And I must say, it's been particularly interesting life experience for me because I started school before the internet, but then by the time I graduated from a bachelor's degree, it was kind of the financial crash time. The internet was everywhere. The smartphone had just been invented. And so I kind of got I don't want to say the best of both worlds, but certainly got a bit of both worlds. And it's, living through that time of transition, I don't know what it would have been like doing it either way, the other way.
Yeah. I mean, you look fondly, I always say you look fondly back in history and say, oh, wouldn't it have been great to live at a more genteel time, the 1600s, during the 1500s, the Renaissance and Michelangelo but no air conditioning. And you take all that technology and you boil it all down, it's a reflection of us as human beings. Human beings aren't perfect. So technology isn't going to be perfect. And, all of the toxicity really is just amplification of those people I was talking about before that for whatever reason, are fallen. And, we're all fallen and we're all damaged to a certain extent. And so, social media is just, it used to be in a small village. Your gossip and your meanness went as far as your voice carried, but it still got around the village. Well, now everybody just has a larger megaphone and the village is a lot bigger.
Good point. It's amplifying the voices, isn't it? It's not necessarily changing. Well, assuming we don't get into the conversation about social media and the algorithm, which I think is probably
that's good too.
Best to avoid that soapbox. What would be your first piece of advice for someone who's maybe a new manager, first-time business owner, somebody like that, who's really struggling to get to grips with what their actual responsibilities are under the law?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would tell them to buy this great new book, The Law at Work, that I wrote, and it's very readable. I tell people I wrote it for non-lawyers. If I'd written it for lawyers, it would be that thick. Because you got to put a lot of extra words in for lawyers. But, I think that's the first thing is really kind of understand, what your responsibilities are. And, it all boils down to this. You got to treat people fairly. And to treat people fairly, you got to come at them where they are. And I always say, diversity is overrated. As an employment lawyer, that raises a lot of eyebrows. But let me tell you what I mean by that. You want no diversity in your organization with respect to your mission. If everybody is homogeneous in that they buy into your mission and you hire the people that are the best to accomplish your mission, you will end up with a diversity of your workplace in the accidental forms of what they look like, what gender they are, how they identify sexually, where they come from, all of those categories that we're protecting. If you focus on that and you focus on hiring in the best interest of your firm or your organization, then you're going to eliminate a lot of problems right off the bat. So you've got to be mission focused and hire to that. And then, going back to what we said at the very beginning, you've got to learn how to communicate. You've got to learn how not everybody knows what you expect. And I'll give you a quick kind of silly example. I had a law partner that he loved for when you stapled a paper, he wanted the staple to be at an angle, not vertical or horizontal, but at an angle because of the way it folded. Well, when we first started practicing together, he didn't tell anybody that. He would just get upset. Why can't these people staple things correctly? And I said, well, have you Have you communicated that? Well, they should just know. I said, no. That's crazy, but I said, it's important to you. So you just need to tell them, and maybe tell them 4 or 5 times. And then when they do it wrong and say, oh, you were serious about that, say, yeah, I was serious about that. And as I say, that's kind of a silly example, but it's a true life example. I mean, that sort of thing is all over the place. So, and I know I'm a broken record, but you've just got to communicate those things. The other thing is, if you're a manager, make friends, get resources within your company's legal department and HR department, and become curious and ravenously hungry about learning all of those policies and procedures, not just learning them on the surface, but what are they designed to do? And, good HR compliance is good business. Hiring fairly, treating people fairly, all of those things are part of HR compliance, but they're also good business. If you have a good record there, you're going to have less turnover, you'll be more profitable and probably more effective.
I like that. It's something to be said in there for understanding the spirit of something as well as the technical definition of it. And I think that's what you mean when you talk about the intent of the law as well as the letter. And your first point, I think, it speaks really well to one of the biggest traps or mistakes that a lot of leaders fall into, which is assuming that everyone else has the same understanding of something as they do. Whether that be, how they want their documents stapled, or I don't know, something a bit more significant, like how to talk to clients, for example. And I think that could, having that conversation early on, you can avoid a lot of tension and conflict in the workplace quite easily, potentially. And,
I think as a worker, it's also incumbent upon you to figure those things out too, to try to anticipate how you can make your boss's life easier. I had a boss once who said there are 2 kinds of people in this world: people who make my life easier and people who don't. And guess who get raises? And, I think that's fair. Companies paying you money, not just to come in and do, a good job. They're paying you to come in and do a great job. And so it needs to be a 2-way street. Neither side needs to be passive. And I think that's part of the issue is, at the end of the day, most people are lazy, or at least take the path of least resistance. And what we're talking about here is, it's hard. It takes a lot of energy and effort, to build a relationship. And that's, again, that's another way of saying what we're saying.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think if we go back to what you were saying earlier about the values and the mission of the organization, I think, yes, people can be naturally lazy. I know I certainly can. But equally, if there's something where they're aligned with the mission, as you described earlier, they've fully bought into that, then they're going to work harder for it. And I think that's where it becomes the responsibility of the leader to get the most out of people. But at the same time, I do agree with you. It is incumbent upon the worker, the employee too, at least to the point of they have a responsibility to ask a question. Like if they don't know something, if they don't understand something, if they don't get the way that it's been explained to them, then they should, put your hand up and say, I don't get that, or how did you want this specifically, or ask that question so that you can do a better job. Because nobody's a mind reader, are they, at the end of the day?
Yeah, and I think humility is a virtue that in our society we've kind of downgraded, and people don't talk about it as much anymore. But I've represented a lot of people who have worked at a place for 10, 12, 20 years, and someone new comes in and has a new way of doing whatever process it is, and they just can't let go of what they've always done. And they don't have the humility to say, okay, she's the boss. This is the way she wants it. I don't agree with it, but I'm going to do it this way. And I think that's also part of it, is you got to have a certain amount of humility. You've got to have a certain amount of humility as a boss to say, okay, I'm coming in and I'm shaking up established workforce, maybe I need to incrementally make these changes and get to know my team better so that my changes are seen as good, not as arbitrary. So I think a dose of humility is good for all of us. It's hard. I know it's hard for me. I've got a big personality. I'm very confident. I'm sure people have described me as arrogant behind my back. Some have done it to my face. So, that's something that we all have to work on. But I think it's, you make that shift and, I think it reduces your stress level a lot if you can let go of a lot of things.
Definitely. I think the key bit there is really it's the two-way street, isn't it? It's whatever it is. I mean, there's so many different concepts in that kind of leader-follower interaction. We could talk about it in terms of trust, respect, communication. I mean, all of these things. It's important that you see it not as a one-directional relationship. It goes both ways. Hopefully most listeners will have seen it and get this reference, but the question is, why should you never do a Jerry Maguire and just walk out on an employer in the way that Tom Cruise did in that film?
Well, I don't want to be that guy, but I will. Jerry Maguire didn't walk out. They told him they were going to fire him. They went to lunch. He went to lunch with his boss who told him he was getting fired. And so Jerry Maguire didn't exactly walk out. But let me say this about that. There's a lot in that question because what Jerry Maguire did in that scene was he started to call his clients to see how many he could take with him, and his boss was doing the same thing. And it really does highlight the notion in 2023 that there's not a whole lot of loyalty. We started talking about the employee at will doctrine, and that's where the American worker starts. And so, your employer doesn't owe you a turkey sandwich on Thanksgiving. Your employer doesn't owe you tomorrow. And so I think everybody has got to take their own bit of where their loyalty begins and ends. Now, while you're working for a company, you have a duty of loyalty, and you as long as you're working there, even if you're thinking, okay, in 2 weeks I'm going to quit, you owe your duty of loyalty to the company. That's why he couldn't make those calls until his boss told him, we're going to fire you. And he did what he had to do to protect himself at that point. And so I come down a little bit differently on that. I think at some point you got to do what you got to do for yourself. But you've got to stay within whatever your own morality is. You certainly don't need to do what Jerry Maguire did, absent a termination and absent a declaration that I'm walking out the door. But I think it really depends on the relationship that you have with your employer. And if you work for the kind of place that at any day, any moment could come in and tell you, hit the bricks without any warning, then you've got to be prepared for that to happen. And of course, he was a sports agent. And so that's a different thing than someone who, has a more inside, administrative kind of job where you really can't protect yourself. But, you've got to always be building your skills and always be building your resume, because you're not guaranteed anything tomorrow. I'll give you an example. At one point I had a lot of clients who were welders, and one thing you've never seen an old welder. It's a very physically demanding job, and there's a shelf life to it. You get to your 40s and sometime between 42 and 52, if you're a welder, you're going to have a career-ending injury. If it's a chronic injury or sudden injury, there's exceptions to everything, but by and large. And so I tell people, look, NFL players, basketball players, baseball players, they know that there's a shelf life to what they can do. And so they've got to be thinking, All right, when I hit 38, what am I going to be doing? I said, you got to do the same thing. This is good money now, but okay, you're not going to, unless you've banked enough money to retire at 50. All right, what are you going to do in your 50s and 60s? And so you've always got to be preparing yourself for that next eventuality, because we all have different chapters in our lives, and each chapter sometimes comes to an end. And I think a lot of times, particularly at mid-level management of big companies, they just think, oh, I'm going to retire as the regional vice president of sales when I'm 65. No, you're not going to. It's not going to happen. You're going to either get forced out or fired. So when you're in your 50s, so they can bring somebody in who's going to be there for the next 20 or 30 years. The only way that you survive at that company is continue to advance. You've got to go from the regional vice president to the brand vice president on up. And that air gets rarer, right? There's not as many of those jobs. So you've always got to be thinking about that, because what you have today is fleeting. 2, 3, 4 years from now, life is going to happen, and you may need to make adjustments. So I don't know if that really answers your Jerry Maguire question, but that's my stream of consciousness from that starting point.
No, there's some very good points in there. I'm just trying to think. It's been so long since I've actually watched that movie. I could have sworn, at the very least, he jumped before he was pushed, didn't he?
I'm pretty sure that at that lunch he told that Jay Moore's character told him he was fired. I'm pretty sure, but yeah, if again, I think in the spirit of your question,
mm-hmm.
I think you've always got to be thinking about next week, and by that I mean, don't burn your bridges. You never know when the people you're working with now are going to become important in your life again. And again, it doesn't hurt to be nice. It doesn't hurt to leave a little on the table as you're going out the door, because you see the same people on the way down as you see on the way up, and circumstances change. And, it's just whether you're a Christian or some other faith tradition, good deeds always, you plant those seeds, and that's just good for the world. And I think being nice is always better than being a jerk. So if your recollection is right, then that's what I would say, is you can't burn your bridges as you're leaving the office.
Yes, I do agree with you in principle. I've not always followed that in practice, to be honest. So one other thought that's popped into my head as well while you're talking. I mean, I guess the whole Jerry Maguire concept is probably quite a way out of date now, isn't it? Because I would assume most businesses in that kind of environment where they're dependent on big ticket clients, there's going to be some kind of non-compete clause in the employment contract, isn't there? So maybe it's all a moot point anyway now.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point. A lot of people have those clauses and they don't understand them, and they don't remember them a lot of times. And that's something that you've always got to consider if you're in that circumstance. And that's one of those things I was talking about. Those things can be negotiated on the front end, and most of the times they can be negotiated on the back end. But you'd rather do it on the front end. And yeah, so I think in 2023 that scene would be very different. Also because of technology, he made a lot of those calls from inside the office, and that might be something that they could put the kibosh on. If that was an employer provided phone, for example, they could shut it off, or they could ask for it back, or other things. So, yeah, lots of movies and television shows would, if you film them today, they'd be very short, because of the cell phone.
Yeah.
Let me call him and make sure. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I was completely wrong about that.
Yeah.
You want me to meet you on top of the Empire State Building? Oh, okay. Well, let me text you. I'm on my way. Sleepless in Seattle is like a 15-minute movie, So that's another example of how technology really has changed a lot of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of those things, I mean, certainly this particular film we're talking about, I think the main difference would be it would, the first sort of 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes be about the same. And then the rest of the film would just be a court case drama, wouldn't it? Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about leadership specifically then. So my first question for you on this one, quite an interesting perspective I'm sure you can bring to this from a career in the legal field, actually. What do you think is the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned from your career so far?
You know, I think it's the importance of relationships. And, you know, when I was younger, I always heard about and saw people who were networking. And I didn't know enough at the time to put it in these terms. But over the years, I've come to label it this way. I always saw networking as transactional. You know, I'm going to this meeting to find people who can help me. And it just seemed kind of phony and transactional to me. Well, it's because I didn't really understand it. But over the years, I've learned that the relationships you build are just make your life so much richer. And as we said at the very, very beginning, it's the more you give to others, the more, you know, if all you're looking for is what do I get out of it? You know, the more you give, the more you get back. And so I think it's really important. You've got to build relationships with if you're a leader in any organization or you've got to build relationships with the people that you're leading so that you know how to speak to them where they are. And if you're relational and not transactional, then you get more to where I was talking about that credit is elastic, where it's just not you're measuring every interaction by, well, am I getting more out of this than I'm putting in? Over the long haul, I think that's key. And the other thing that kind of goes along with that is authenticity. I mean, people talk about that a lot now, but it's so true. It's like the old joke, you know, if you can fake sincerity, you can do anything. No, I'm just saying about being authentic, being authentically yourself. And I think that's always been a tough human problem, is we have so many insecurities and so many fears and so many defenses that we've erected to make sure we don't get hurt, right? Physically and emotionally. That sometimes we're not authentically us. And again, I think when you approach leadership authentically, this is who I am. And, you know, again, you own it and you say, yeah, you know, and one problem I have is I tend to silo myself. I get so in my head about what's going on that I forget to communicate out to people. And so a lot of times I have to say, look, you know, if I get that way, I'm sorry, I'm working to not be that way, but help me get out of my silo. And I think people appreciate that. I was driving to give a speech a weekend or two ago, and I was going pretty fast. And I get pulled over, and the state trooper walks up to me and he says, you know, you were going pretty fast. And he tells me how fast I was going. And I said, yeah, that's pretty fast. He said, why are you going that fast? I said, no good reason. And he walked back to his car and, you know, did whatever they do and came back. So I'm going to give you a warning and you can go. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons he did that was, that I was authentically, I wasn't trying to get out of it. I fully expected to get a ticket, probably deserved a ticket. But for whatever reason, he decided not to give me one. And I attribute that to just being transparent and owning what I had done. And I think if I had tried to talk him out of it, I wasn't going that fast, or I've got an important meeting, or don't you know who I am, which is a phrase that's said right before a tragedy happens. Don't you know who I am? That just shows you that nobody knows who you are if you got to say that. So yeah, I think being authentic is really, really important.
I agree. And you're right. It's certainly got a lot more attention of late. And I wonder if part of that isn't because some of what we were talking about earlier about kind of the rise of the internet. And I mean, certainly the last couple of years as well with the shift to remote and then back and then hybrid and all of that. But it's become easier to section off your life, hasn't it? And you can hide behind the internet to a great extent. And if you don't have to physically go to work, then it's a lot easier to not show your true self in a lot of ways. And maybe that's why it's resonating with a lot of people so much now, not just in the case of leadership, but like personal branding, marketing, all of those kind of areas too. What has been your personal best experience of being led?
From 2016 to 2020, I was our mayor's special counsel. I was his senior policy advisor. It's a great job. Enjoyed doing it. And he is a tremendous leader. Name's Jim Strickland. And he would do several things. One is he would listen to a lot of opinions. And we had a meeting every Friday, and he would go around the room. It was senior leadership team, and we'd all give reports. But then at the end, he would maybe have 2 or 3 issues, and he'd say, "Okay, what do you all think about this?" And he'd throw it out on the table, and we'd talk about it. And he wouldn't have a vote on it because it was his call, but he would listen, and then he would make a decision, and then he would stick to it. And that's so rare for a politician. And as I say, as a recovering politician, I can say that. And again, just that, and he was a very authentic guy. He is who he is. But just having that integrity, having that backbone to say, this is my decision, and have it be a reasoned decision and sticking with it. I saw what that did to city government because, people knew that the mayor had their back, when they were executing a policy. So I think Jim Strickland as mayor is probably by far and away the best leadership that I've ever had in my life.
Sounds good. Sounds like he's ticking a lot of the boxes there, definitely. All the more impressive in a politician. I say as a long-suffering voter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, this is going to be a difficult question, I think, but let's see. If you could go back in time to the beginning of your career, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I would tell myself that networking is not. I would go back and say, look, what you're concerned about is the transactional nature of this. Build relationships. Relationships are what's going to sustain you throughout your career. And as I said, not just years, I mean, decades, I didn't understand that. And so without hesitation, that's what I would go back and tell my younger self.
I know what you mean about networking, though. And I think, a similar experience, actually, I used to do it in exactly the same way. But I think it does also depend on the group that you network with and the forum for doing that. Because there's some really terrible ones out there, but there's also some really, really good ones. So I think that can have an impact, definitely.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay, and last question. This one is my favorite question. I hope you've got a good answer for it, but no pressure, no pressure.
Oh, okay.
So it's called Leadership Heroes. And the question is, you get pretty much free reign, but if you had to pick one person, they can be alive or dead, past or present, someone from history, real or fictitious. If you get really stuck, that's usually quite a good out. Who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership? Who would that person be and why?
Well, I would be remiss if I did not say Jesus Christ. I think if you go back and you look at Jesus as a leader, first of all, he's a servant leader. He realized that the leader has to be the first servant. And then he picked people he picked his apostles and disciples very carefully. And he picked people that he knew he could count on to further his mission when he was gone. And he was very, very smart about that. And he picked people that that again were diverse in a lot of different ways, but who bought into his mission. And he was all about self-sacrifice. I mean, you walk by a crucifix, and that tells you what he thought he had to do for his friends. He emptied himself for others. In Christian theology, it was the one and only completely selfless act in the history of humanity. Again, if you buy into Christian theology. And so it shows you the power of sacrifice, and it shows you the power of humility. Because again, whether you no matter what you think of him, look at the legacy that he left behind. Started with 12 guys in Palestine in the first century. So that would be my that's my leadership hero.
Yeah, it's always an interesting pick, I must say, and it's not the first time we've had it, but I like your explanation better, I think, particularly the point about legacy, because that's one aspect of leadership that is oft forgotten, isn't it? It's passing the leadership on. It's the succession plan, or however else we might choose to describe it, but it's creating future leaders. And that's, very clearly, as you said, that's what happened there. That was the purpose of the disciples, wasn't it? And I really like the servant leadership analogy there as well. That's spot on, I think. Yeah, great pick.
Thank you.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for your time. As a very, very last question, if any of the listeners would like to learn more about you, perhaps get a copy of that book, would you like to point them towards a website or something that they can get more information?
Again, the book is The Law at Work, and it's on Amazon. It's on Walmart.com and BarnesandNoble.com, all those kind of places. If you Google Alan Crone, ALANCRONE, Attorney Memphis, you will get more hits than you probably want, but that's how to find me. I'm here to help. So if I can help anybody, I'd be honored to do so.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really nice conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed meeting you, and thanks for your time.
Likewise. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for some challenging questions. Some I hadn't thought of, so that's always a lot of fun.
Well, I'll do my best.
All right, David. Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much, Alan. That was a really interesting conversation, and you're a very engaging guest. So very much appreciate you for your time there. Listeners, if you would like to get a copy of Alan's book or learn more about him, I've put a link to his website in the episode description, so you will find him easily. If you're a new leader and you'd like to learn more about leading with integrity, and we did talk about networking a little bit in this episode, so if you'd like to build your network of other leaders, be part of a supportive community of leadership, then join the Integrity Leaders and Group Program. It's an online community. It's low cost, very low barrier to entry, and you are very welcome. So head over to the website and find out more. It's www.leadernotaboss.com. And I hope to see you there very shortly. And all that's left for me to say is thank you for listening. Please do join me again next week. We're going to be having a really interesting conversation about the crossovers between introverts, management, extroverts, and some of the challenges and opportunities that we might find in that with my guest next week, Tom Cleary. So I hope you'll be able to join us and listen in on that one as well. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves. Don't forget to network and be a leader, not a boss.